Hi, Derek.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
Pretty good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Derek Davison, and you wear, I guess, more than one hat. A couple of them are under the Foreign Exchanges brand. You put out
Yes.
a podcast called Foreign Exchanges. You put out a Substack newsletter whose official name is either FX or Foreign Exchanges.
No, it's Foreign Exchanges. I just use FX as shorthand.
Okay.
I'm hoping that the people at FX TV station don't yell at me someday for that. But,
you haven't been sued yet?
Not yet. No, I've been able to dodge it so far.
That would be good publicity. I'm waiting for some major entity to sue me and really put me on the map. I keep trying to antagonize them, but they seem unaware of me.
That's a good point, actually. Maybe I should be rooting for that.
Totally. You're something of an expert in foreign affairs, especially. I guess your educational pedigree has to do largely with Islamic studies. Is that right?
Yeah, Middle Eastern studies and Middle Eastern history. I came close to getting a PhD, but not all the way.
Okay. You kept a barely safe distance from that.
Yeah, exactly. I kept a little, comfort zone there.
Okay. And you were also editor of Low Blog, which evolved into Responsible Statecraft, which is the publication of the Quincy Institute.
Correct. I was the last editor with Jim Loeb there on Low Blog.
Yeah, Loeb's been, Jim has been on the show. He's a good guy. He should come back. It's been too long.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about more than one thing, but I thought we should start out on Iraq, since the U.S. Within the last week launched strikes on a militia there, I guess, and
militias, yeah,
more than one.
Yeah, there were two of them: Kataib Hezbollah and Kataib Sayyid al-Shuhada.
Okay, that sounded better coming from you than it would have from me. That sounded very authentic. There has been retaliation since then. I guess the strikes were in response to drone strikes that had targeted American soldiers in Iraq, but the retaliation came against American forces in Syria.
Yes, right. There were, these militias operate on both sides of the border. They've gone into Syria to help Bashar al-Assad and kind of set up shop mostly along the border region, but to some degree, like Kataib Sayyid al-Shuhada is active in Damascus, for example, or has been. So the strikes were retaliation for a lot of recent attacks against U.S. personnel, but I think especially the rise of drone attacks, which I get the sense has the United States a little bit concerned that they're moving from relatively primitive, kind of dumb rockets, Katyusha rockets, to something more sophisticated. And so, that kind of sparked the retaliation. But they hit, I think, two facilities in Syria and one in Iraq that are used by these two militias, and maybe more. We don't. It's not clear.
Now, these are, I assume these are missile firing drones and not kamikaze drones?
That I don't know. I get the sense that they're not missile firing drones, that's a little more advanced, but I may be wrong about that. Well, they're probably either kamikaze drones or something relatively unsophisticated that would drop like a grenade or something on a target, but I don't know. I don't know that for a fact. I mean, they are getting them probably from Iran, which does have some more sophisticated technology, but I can't say exactly how sophisticated these are.
I mean, the reason I ask is because in principle, kamikaze drones seem extremely easy to create. I mean, just a hobbyist can order a drone that can carry enough explosive to kill a person. And I've almost wondered why this hasn't become a bigger problem just from crazy like terrorists in any given country, including America.
Yeah. I mean, the technology is ubiquitous, even for something like a quadcopter that you can rig up to like drop an explosive on a target. ISIS or the Islamic State, whatever you want to call it, has used that technology. It's off the shelf, basically. I mean, you just buy these things and kind of jury rig them and they do your thing. I've been a little bit curious about that too, because there's this, on the United States side of this, there's been a tendency to build like bigger and fancier and, more expensive, like really more expensive, drones. And I think we're seeing some other countries like China's done this. Turkey's doing it increasingly, building, much less sophisticated drones that still get the job done, but don't cost you $100 million a pop. Yeah. And, the technology is not proprietary. There's nothing particularly sensitive about it. So they're easier to export. You don't have to worry about, forbidden technology falling into evil hands. And yeah, they get the same job done for substantially less cost. I'm not quite sure why it's taken this long to get to that place, but that seems to be where we're heading.
Yeah, it just seems like a technology that could raise the costs of occupation for a force that is not welcomed by everyone in the country, which seems to be the case with our forces in Iraq.
Yes, certainly. I mean, we're at almost a year and a half now since the Iraqi parliament voted to get the U.S. out of the country, and we're still there. So, yeah, it's not wanted.
So that's a strange feature of this, is that if you ask us why we did it, I assume we'd say both that we were protecting our own troops, but that in a certain sense, our presence is supposed to be there on behalf of the Iraqi government, right? I mean, we don't claim to be illegal occupiers of the country, right?
No, I mean, yeah, in Iraq especially. Syria is different. I mean, we are clearly occupying part of Syria, but Iraq is supposed to be at the behest of the Iraqi government.
And yet the government condemned our attack on people in Iraq. And I've seen different kinds of news accounts of this, some kind of suggesting that, well, the government has to say this for political reasons, but its heart is not really in it. It's kind of caught between, the Americans and these militias. Do you have can you illuminate the government's perspective a little?
I mean, I think that's part of it. There is a sense that, the successive prime ministers of Iraq, and they've had many, obviously, because the government has been more or less dysfunctional since the U.S. invasion. But successive prime ministers have been, they had to do this dance to even get the job, let alone stay in it for any length of time, where they're kind of caught between Iran on the one hand and the United States on the other, and they have to sort of appease both. And this is, yes, there is some of that. You sort of have to make a statement like this, criticizing the United States for an attack like this. But I do think the comments that Mustafa Kadhimi made this time after these strikes they seemed significantly more pointed to me than previous comments. And I think there's a good deal of frustration, that the United States ostensibly in Iraq to protect Iraq from a resurgence of the Islamic State is using Iraq as a platform to, sort of tweak Iran or contain Iran or whatever the policy is. I'm not sure from day to day. But, I think in some sense, the last straw was the Qasem Soleimani attack in, January 2020, which was conducted on Iraqi soil. And it was just like incredibly disdainful. And admittedly, this is a different administration in Washington now, so, they might not have done the same thing. But it was incredibly disdainful of Iraqi sovereignty. Soleimani was in Iraq at the behest of the Iraqi government. He was there to meet with people, in the Iraqi government. And the United States just availed itself of the opportunity to kill him on Iraqi soil. It's a huge insult to the Iraqi government. And I think the frustration level with the United States doing these kinds of things, kind of freelancing against Iranian interests in Iraq is really building up on the part of the Iraqi government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as I recall, candidate Joe Biden responded to that by kind of warning about how it could lead to escalation and be a bad idea kind of tactically, but I don't think he condemned it as a violation of Iraqi sovereignty or anything.
No, I don't. I mean, yeah, that didn't seem to be a consideration for anybody in the U.S. at the time.
Yeah. Maybe we should talk a little more about the character of these militias. They're commonly identified as Iran-backed, and I'm sure they in some sense are, but there are, degrees of backing. Or let me put it another way. There are degrees of autonomy that forces that are in some sense proxies can have. And I don't really, and I think, generally when you hear the term, certainly when you hear the term proxy or Iran-backed or Russia-backed or whatever, you kind of tend to imagine them just taking orders from the sponsor country. And in this case, I honestly don't. And I know in some cases that's a misleading way to think about it because these groups have their own political interests and sometimes, decide to take action. They may or may not clear it with the sponsor, but in any event, the initiative isn't coming from the sponsor. I have no idea what the situation is with these militias. How would you just describe like what they're about and what their decision-making paradigm is? There's
so many of them. You can't really talk about all of them as one thing. And I wouldn't, even pretend to know all of them because there's too many to track for somebody who's not like a specialist in Iraqi militias. But
are a lot of them? There are a lot of them that actually get some backing from Iran.
The Shia militias, I think many of them do. There are some Shia militias that are more directly affiliated with Iraq's Shia establishment. So like Muqtada Sadr or Ayatollah Sistani, that are more aligned with them. And there's, despite the fact, I think the United States often conflates all Shia as being kind of under Iran's thumb on some level. There are clear divergences between them. Most of the big ones, though, I think are in Iran's orbit to some degree. But as you say, it's not a direct relationship. They're not taking day-to-day orders from Iran, and they don't necessarily even do what Iran wants them to do at any given time. And this is an error, I think, that bleeds into a lot of coverage of the Middle East. You talk about the Houthi movement in Yemen, you talk about Hezbollah in Lebanon. There's this sense that they're taking marching orders from Tehran 24 hours a day, and that's simply not the case. The best example I can give in Iraq was, part of the lead up to the attack, the strike that killed Soleimani was this sort of back and forth tension between the militias in the United States, and the U.S. conducted a couple of airstrikes. And at one point, the militias, I think, stormed a U.S. consulate in southern Iraq. And I may be remembering this wrong, but my recollection is that was not something like there was talk of, Iran kind of not wanting them to do that, like, saying you don't antagonize in this way. And the militias sort of went ahead and did it anyway. And that's the kind of thing that, they get support, they get some coordination, but it's not, it's not 100% by any means.
So it's possible that in the Soleimani assassination, what we would have cited as kind of the proximate provocation actually hadn't come from Iran, in fact.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say.
Yeah.
I mean, Soleimani was such a, important figure that there was probably some,
it would have been,
that was in motion.
You could have
anyway.
found something he did that led to American deaths at some point in the past.
Right. But there was a context of this back and forth it was Kataib Hezbollah, in fact, like a back and forth between the U.S. and that militia that seemed to culminate in the Soleimani assassination.
Okay. So, it sounds pretty complicated. You've got, it sounds like you could broadly divide the Shia militia into, well, even that I'm sure would be too simple, but think of them as some that have fairly close links to Iran, some, that don't. I mean, there is a very large Shia population in Iraq after all. And then, of course, you've got the Sunnis. I mean, to what extent, I guess one question is, to what extent are politics in Iraqi divided along sectarian lines to begin with? That, of course, was one thing that, I guess many Americans discovered for the first time after we invaded Iraq. That, there were Shia and there were Sunni, and Iraq had long been run largely by Sunni, even though there was a Shia majority. And so disrupting that could lead to a certain amount of instability, as it did. Is it still fair to characterize that as like the fundamental political dividing line in Iran, Sunni Shia?
I think it's hard.
Iraq. Sorry.
I think it's hard to say that. To me, you would have to unpack a lot of layers of corruption and the dysfunction that causes to get at sectarianism as a problem. The big issue from my admittedly kind of outsider understanding of Iraqi politics is the real problem is you have a lot of sort of ineffectual party bosses in Baghdad who want to hand out offices as rewards to backers and to their supporters and kind of control their own fiefdoms. And that kind of freezes the government in place. You have the same group of people that don't get anything done, that kind of control Iraqi politics. And it's been very hard. And this has been the frustration. That's why I think you see protests, really mostly in the Shia heavy parts of the country in southern Iraq, Baghdad and south. The protests are over these kind of this political elite that really is just, prevents even basic services from happening, like electricity provision and, infrastructure development, because they are kind of tied up in their little, political infighting and political games. And I think, to say to what degree that's driven by sectarianism, I think sectarianism is probably pretty far down on the list at this point. It's really more this kind of corruption and office seeking and that sort of thing. So
you mentioned Muqtada al-Sadr, who's been a figure from ever since immediately after the invasion, a figure of significance. He is Shia who has always seemed to be something of a populist. I mean, he it seems to me he has a pretty big, lower income constituency. Is that right? So I would imagine he would be railing against corrupt elites. And as I recall, it seems to me he, like a decade ago or something or 15 years ago or something was thought of as pretty tight with Iran, but at some point I recall him starting to say things suggesting that it was quite the opposite. So what is his status? He was a very important figure in the early kind of Shia resistance.
Yeah, he was one of the big kind of militia leaders, basically, that resisted what I think would be properly termed U.S. occupation at that point in the early kind of years after the war. Muqtada Sadr has been, it seems to me, fairly mercurial about a lot of these things. You're right. He kind of positioned himself as a populist. For a while, he was, viewed as close to Iran. Then, as I think resentment has started to grow toward Iran among some Iraqi Shia who view kind of Iranian interference as part of the problem in Baghdad, he sort of shifted and started criticizing the Iranians. At some point during the protests, and there were, kind of major protests that began in late 2019 against the Iraqi government and turned very violent for a time. At some point, Muqtada Sadr went from kind of being part of that movement to coming in and trying to position himself as a political kingmaker in Baghdad. And even at one point turned his own militia on the protesters to kind of, assist Iraqi police in suppressing these things. And I think has lost as a result some of that populist cred, but I don't, he's not as prominent, it seems to me, as he was. And maybe that's part of the reason why, but I couldn't say that for sure. Okay.
And what is the disposition of the government with respect to the sectarian issue? I mean, I didn't even know whether the prime minister is Shia or Sunni. I'm sure you do.
The makeup, it's similar to the Lebanese, the rules about the Lebanese government. The prime minister is Shia, must be Shia. The president of Iraq is a Kurd, Barham Saleh.
And this is this is mandated.
Yeah, it's in the sort of rules. I don't know if it's rises to the constitutional level, but it's in the sort of rules that the U.S. and Iraq kind of hashed out after the invasion for the new government. The Speaker of Parliament is supposed to be a Sunni Arab, so those are kind of the three main offices, and then you have, and this is part of the problem in terms of kind of the bloat and the corruption in Baghdad. You have a lot of offices underneath those three, like deputy prime ministers, and that are all kind of supposed to be parceled out to each community, and that's what leads to a lot of kind of shifting offices around and trying to put your supporters or your backers in an office where they basically do make work. I mean, it's a cushy job for not a lot of responsibility.
And so I assume the corruption is manifested in a certain amount of just day-to-day dysfunction in the government's provision of services, and that's one thing a lot of people don't like.
Yeah, I mean, it especially hits hard in the summer, and you see a rise in protests over the last few years. There's been an escalation kind of consistently in the summer because the temperatures, especially the last few years, thanks I think in part to climate change, the temperatures in southern Iraq in the summer are just unbearable. So the demand for air conditioning goes up, the demand for electricity goes up, and Iraq, despite having vast hydrocarbon resources, doesn't provide enough electricity. It imports a good deal of electricity from Iran, in fact. And so, you have a lot of blackouts. The infrastructure is not good. The power grid's not stable, and people get frustrated and they go out in the streets and protest.
Is this discontent to some extent, kind of a trans-sectarian uniter of Iraqis? I mean, does that subdue the ethnic tensions? The fact that lots of diversity of people hate the government?
Most of the protests you hear about are in the Shia, the predominantly Shia parts of the country. So in Baghdad and to the south, I don't hear so much about protests in let's say the Arab Sunni region and the Kurdish region. The Kurdistan regional government is really more the authority there. There have been some protests against the KRG, and there is, kind of in a microcosm, some of the same dysfunction, but the KRG has enough autonomy that they kind of are able to manage some of these things independently of Baghdad. It's a good question. And I haven't seen reporting on a lot of major protests in Sunni dominant cities. And part of that may be because they're still rebuilding a lot of those places. I mean, Mosul's still, mostly in rubble, and Fallujah and Ramadi, places that IS captured and have been really pulverized. The big issue in those places is a lot of people are still displaced. They're still in camps. And that's really, there's frustration over that. But they may not, I don't think the situation there is at the point where you can complain about the electricity turning off. There are still bigger kind of recovery issues being dealt with. Okay.
And then maybe my last sectarian question for a while. Is there a clear-cut correlation with kind of socioeconomic class? Are Shia, broadly speaking, are on average lower income level than Sunni or anything like that?
I don't, at this point, I don't know. There was obviously, when Saddam Hussein was in power, there was a clear preference on some level for, a Sunni ruling elite right. in the Ba'ath Party. The Baathism never had historically never really had a lot of appeal for Shia. But there were still, wealthy Shia, middle-class Shia. It was, kind of up and down the line. I think there's probably more, kind of lower-class, working-class Shia, but that's largely a function of the fact that they are the majority of the population, and there's just more of everything, in that particular segment.
Okay. So as for the kind of military situation, I gather there are Iran-backed militias that would like the U.S. to leave the country, but also militias that are not so closely aligned with Iran that would also like the U.S. to leave the country.
I think there's still some concern about IS. There's some concern that if the United States leaves, then
that's the Islamic State.
Right. And there's some concern that if the United States leaves, then this kind of balancing game that's been going on is going to shift completely in Iran's direction. And a lot of people, I think, don't want that. So there are concerns.
You mean a lot of Iraqis don't want that?
A lot of Iraqis, right. A lot of Iraqis don't want that. That doesn't mean that they want the U.S. military in Iraq. It just means, there are considerations about what a withdrawal would look like. Mm-hmm. The Iraqi government, the executive branch, the prime minister and the cabinet, I think doesn't want the United States to leave necessarily. I don't think Mustafa al-Kadhimi wants the United States to leave. But he does have to be responsive to the parliament, which is, a little more dominated by kind of anti-U.S. interests, and voted again after the Soleimani incident, voted to order the United States out. It was a non-binding vote, but it still reflected, a political reality in Baghdad. I think there are concerns about what might happen if the United States pulls out. But I would say, for the most part, we're not a popular presence, especially when we do things like attacking militia camps or, attacking Iranian diplomatic visitors and things like that. It's really, doesn't do much for the U.S. standing in that country.
And among people who have the concern about the U.S. pulling out, the concern is to some extent that there would be a resurgence of the Islamic State, or that's just one of many concerns.
I think it's probably, it's an array of things, and not everybody's going to have the same level of concern, but certainly the Islamic State is not gone. It carries out attacks, largely in sort of across the middle band in the country, in Anbar province, and, to some extent in Kirkuk or around Kirkuk and Diyala, it's still active. So I think on some level there is a concern that it could come back a little bit. And of course, it's, if you go across the border, it's still, we know it still has a presence in the Syrian desert, where, it's really difficult to kind of track anybody down and do anything about it. But they're still engaged in fighting with the Syrian military and other forces there.
Yeah. I mean, of course, Iran would be happy to try to help Iraq take care of the Islamic State, I'm sure.
They have done, and by some standards, I would say the lion's share. I mean, it was the militias. Part of the reasons the militias exist still, you can date many of them back to the U.S. Invasion, but a lot of them kind of either formed or got a second wind when the Islamic State swept through in 2014. And they were like the last line of defense as the Iraqi military was crumbling and falling back. The militias were the forces that kind of stood up and halted that advance.
And for the Shia militias, I mean, the Islamic State is almost an existential threat, right? I mean, they would not fare well in an Iraq run by the Islamic State.
No, certainly not. Yeah, certainly not.
So I guess the this thought experiment is too complicated to conduct probably. Like, what would happen if the U.S. withdrew? I'm sure there are different theories. I mean, it seems like it would lend power to two opposing forces, the Islamic State and Iran, for starters, right? And they don't like each other, so it's kind of unclear what would happen there. And I have no idea what else would happen. I mean, maybe there's a fear of just more broad-based dissolution or something. I don't.
Yeah, it's almost too incomprehensible to think about. But I mean, the United States, still is the main. Again, more on the executive side of the Iraqi government, but the United States is still the main kind of prop up, kind of support pillar for the Iraqi government. For us to withdraw, I think, I think the doomsday scenario of like either the Islamic State sweeping across the Middle East again, or Iran kind of building this, new empire, which is what you hear sometimes from from hawks in Washington. I don't think either of those things would happen. I suspect it would be, it would not be quite that catastrophic. And I think, the Iraqi government would certainly face some. It would be destabilizing. I mean, it would destabilize the status quo. I would argue that the status quo in Iraq is not very good. And maybe should be destabilized. But yeah, it's hard to know exactly, what kind of effect that would have on Iraqi politics. Yeah,
I mean, it kind of reminds me of Afghanistan in the sense that, I mean, if the presence of a, relatively small number of American troops, although very high-tech and well-armed and capable American troops, is essential to the survival of the government on a day-to-day basis, I mean, the underlying situation is just not very healthy, right? I mean,
right.
There's just something weird about that. And yet the only way to get to something that might be a healthier situation seems to be to do something that in the short term is destabilizing, which is for the U.S. to leave.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's quite as precarious as Afghanistan, where, the Taliban really, may well take over the country once the U.S. leaves. And that's, for a lot of people in Afghanistan is for obvious reasons, not a desirable outcome. I don't think the Iraqi government is going to collapse. I don't think you're going to have some other force taking power in Baghdad if the United States leaves. But yeah, it would certainly shake up what has become a pretty dysfunctional, has been really, I mean, I shouldn't say become, has been for quite some time now, a very dysfunctional political kind of stasis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a little hard for me to imagine, like, I guess, how exactly the troops there are vital to the ongoing strength of the government, such as it is. I mean, I guess that just consists of their ability to basically blow away any armed forces that generate great significant threat to the government. Is that it? Like,
yeah, I think, I mean, from the Iraqi side, it's just sort of having them there on some level. Although, again, I don't think their presence is that popular. The U.S. side, like, I there was the Quincy Institute actually did a thing a couple of days ago that, I had to laugh. They were they put out a new paper that said, it's time to bring all U.S. forces home from the Middle East, and, laying out the case for that. And they did a little symposium around the paper. And I don't know if you're familiar with Paul Pillar. He's
Sure.
an ex-CIA analyst who does, a lot of foreign policy writing now. And he made, I think, a very apt comment, which was, basically U.S. military forces are in the Middle East to counter attacks on U.S. military forces in the Middle East, like to sort of prevent those attacks from ever, to deter those attacks from happening. But that's really what it is at this point. It's sort of this weird kind of circular logic that we're in the Middle East to deter Iran from attacking U.S. interests, but the only place that Iran can attack U.S. interests is in the Middle East. So, what is the sort of logic to staying there? Only in Washington does that make sense, I guess. But from the Iraqi perspective, I think it's just basically a counterweight type of a thing.
Yeah. Now, Paul is so smart and level-headed, and he at one point was, I think, in charge of gathering national intelligence for that whole region. He was the senior intelligence officer for the whole region, and I encourage people just to Google him and read whatever he says about anything in the areas. The last name is Pillar. As for our presence in the region, do you have a sense for what the Biden administration's rationale for it is? Of course, they inherited the situation. It's not that easy to get out of. On the other hand, the Syrian part of the presence, which is a little stranger than the Iraqi. I mean, we all know how we wound up in Iraq, right? But the Syrian thing actually started on Obama's watch, right? I mean, we think of a lot of people think of Trump as having kind of escalated that, but I specifically remember when Obama said, okay, we're going to intervene, we're going to help the rebels, but there will be no boots on the ground. I think he used that phrase. And then I remember they established pretty soon some boots on the ground, not many, a few hundred or something, but I remember tweeting like, oh, that didn't last long or something, like, the boots on the ground pledge. And I thought the tweet might get some traction, but it got like zero. And of course, sometimes there are all kinds of reasons a tweet can get no traction, but it just seemed like, I just thought, wait, we're crossing a major threshold here and no one seems to be paying much attention. And now we have more troops there. And now, Trump has said, well, now they're there so we can take the oil, basically, with admirable candor, I thought. Give him credit for some things.
Yeah, and Trump actually drew down that force
after building it up, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, they sort of, the logic was... Yeah. No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say, he himself, part of him wanted to get out entirely, and he kept kind of trying, but he just... I don't know what combination of forces prevented it. I mean, let's face it, he's a guy who chronically cannot get his shit together. So it's not surprising that he wouldn't get us a complex task performed. Right. But at the same time, there was resistance from various places in the establishment, and he couldn't overcome it. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, the initial, Obama's initial response to the Syrian rebellion, to the civil war, was, we're going to work with the rebels. We're not going to do, we're going to have direct U.S. intervention, but we could arm these groups and train them and that kind of thing. And that then, briefly escalated into potential airstrikes after there were, allegations of Assad using chemical weapons. And, he backed down in the face of congressional opposition. It wasn't until 2014. And again, I mean, it had to do with the Islamic State and that kind of their sudden kind of sweep through a third of Iraq that all of a sudden, the United States was back in this region to like moving in the opposite direction. I mean, we had sort of been withdrawing. We'd withdrawn to a large extent from Iraq. And now, at that point, it was like, we got to go back in. And at some point, during that mission, they decided, or Obama decided, that we couldn't just operate in Iraq. We had to go into Syria to do the same thing, to counter the Islamic State because of the fact that the Islamic State kind of ignored that Iraq-Syria border and they were operating on both sides of it. And then, as you say, Trump kind of escalated that. And
I notice from the background voice that the word Syria seems to sound like the word Siri.
Sorry about that. I don't know. She's a little sensitive today.
Like many people, she thinks the whole world is about her.
But Trump escalated that deployment and working with the Kurds, mostly the Syrian Democratic Forces, and they finally captured IS's capital in Syria and Rajaf I'm sorry, I'm like blanking out, but they finally captured, did away with IS in at least that part of northeastern Syria where the Kurds predominate. And then it was at that point that Trump, you saw Trump kind of trying to get U.S. forces out of Syria and being thwarted, to some degree by his own administration. But the presence there now, is again, it's the mission is sort of justified as we have to stay in case of a resurgence by the Islamic State, but they're really there. One, to squat on the oil fields, which, as you say, Trump was sort of admirably frank about. And two, as this sort of, again, kind of counterweight to Iran, because there's this perception that if the U.S. Were to leave, Iran would just kind of control this entire crescent of territory from everywhere from Yemen all the way around to Lebanon.
Which would be a problem for what reason? Because it could more readily supply arms to Hezbollah, and Israel wouldn't like that, or what?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it. I think that's the underlying thing is Iran could make itself more of a problem for Israel. But there's sort of you don't even get to that level in the sort of discourse about it in Washington. It's just like manifestly Iran having influence anywhere is a bad thing, like ipso facto. Like there's no you don't usually get to kind of get people to drill down into why that should matter.
And do you have a sense, I mean, to get back to Iran's influence in Iraq, as well as, but also, I mean, is to include their influence in Syria, to what extent, they consider the American presence in both places a threat to them, an actual threat to Iran's, security?
I mean, there is some, again, a lot of this kind of influence did develop in, I hate to keep going back to the Islamic State because it's played out at this point, but, that's where a lot of this the sort of increase in Iranian influence and involvement, the kind of direct involvement in Iraq and, kind of developed because there was a concern about, how quickly the Islamic State had kind of swept through and what that meant for the region and kind of, the need to bolster the Iraqi government and the Iraqi military, even as a sort of buffer for Iran. Syria, it's more like Bashar al-Assad was sort of Iran's one close Arab ally at the kind of level of a national government. If you ignore groups like Hezbollah, like, non-state actors like Hezbollah and the Houthis. And so, there was an obvious kind of desire to make sure he stayed in power and keep that structure in place. But
in terms of Iran's ongoing hostility to an American presence in the region, I mean, that's not about IS, right? I mean, do they consider, I mean, as you suggest, as Paul Pillar kind of noted, I mean, we're taking that as the reason to oppose Iran. And yet if we weren't there, that wouldn't exist. It's right. And so I guess the question is, I mean, why do they find the American presence in the region undesirable? Do they find it literally threatening, or what?
Yeah. I mean, the American presence, I think, is literally threatening, because the American presence in the region, in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf, and in Iraq is really motivated by a desire to kind of surround and contain Iran. So I think there is a correct, I would argue, sense that this is a threat to the Iranian regime. And when you have people in Washington, not every administration, not always talking openly about this, but the obvious kind of overarching goal of U.S. Iran policy since 1979 has been regime change. Despite, a couple of occasions, there's been a couple of occasions where they've sort of backed off of that. And, the Obama administration kind of pulled back in the second half of his second term. But for the most part, it's been, making it impossible for the Iranian government to function and trying to create the conditions under which it could be overthrown, whether kind of internally, or, I think after the invasion of Iraq, the concern was we could be next. And, that's to have a hostile and openly hostile world power kind of surrounding your country. And this gets into the U.S. presence in Afghanistan to some extent as well. It's deeply kind of disconcerting to the Iranians.
Although, of course, Iran doesn't like the Taliban either.
They do increasingly.
Do they?
They've been working with the Taliban for a few years now, both as sort of a kind of a way to disrupt the U.S. presence in Afghanistan. And again, I keep coming back to these guys, but again, the Islamic State had a moment there in Afghanistan where it looked like it was kind of really on the rise, and the Taliban were sort of, for the Iranians, the lesser of two evils, and they made the decision to start kind of collaborating with them. Now, it is true that in the 90s, when the Taliban was in charge of Afghanistan, they really did not get along with one another, the Iranian government and that Taliban government.
And as for Iran's finding the U.S. threatening, I mean, we did help depose a democratically elected leader in 1953, which was and install a dictator, which was the fundamental grievance fueling the 1979 revolution. And then more recently, I guess we more or less supported Iraq during the Iran-Iraq war. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's the more salient historical grievance. Mossadegh, the overthrow of Mossadegh is a sort of something that Iranians often point to as a grievance. I don't know how relevant it is for the Iranian government now, the post 1979 government, because Mossadegh's legacy is a complicated one. He was pretty secular and, not a religious guy. And so he's not somebody that, like, Khomeini never had anything nice Ayatollah Khomeini never really had anything nice to say about Mossadegh. So it's a little complicated. They do sometimes point to that and say, look, you can't trust the U.S. But I think for most Iranians and, especially the generation that kind of lived through and experienced that war, which was extremely violent and led to, caused, a lot of deaths, Saddam Hussein using, chemical weapons against Iran and they kind of experienced that trauma. The big grievance is that the United States, basically was, had thrown in with Saddam and supported him.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And, one more question about those oil fields. I assume that, although Trump, I'm sure, when he thinks of oil fields, he thinks of dollar signs. I would think that the motivation of the U.S. in hanging on to those has more to do with depriving the Assad government access to them, right? I mean, it's part of its not letting go of the war against the regime, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's still some kind of dead-ender sense in Washington that they can force Assad to not kind of, depose himself and go off into exile, but make some political reforms, some kind of nod at democratization. I mean, it's a fringe thing, I think, at this point in DC. But the idea is that if you deprive the Syrian government of its main resources, and those kind of eastern oil fields are one of its main economic kind of support pillars. If you deprive them of access to that, then you interfere with rebuilding the country, and you can sort of, have a basis you have some leverage to negotiate then over the reconstruction process.
I see. So it's possibly about leverage in negotiation with Assad, not necessarily about regime change.
Well, I mean, I think that the goal either way is regime change, either to right. like force Assad out and kind of by depriving, as is the policy in Iraq and Venezuela, a lot of places to force these undesirable governments out by depriving the people of.
You said Iraq. Do you mean Iran?
I mean, yeah, Iran. Sorry. Uh-huh. To sort of create so much misery that the people kind of rise up and get rid of these governments for us. That may be one aspect of it, but I think the other part of this is could you kind of use that leverage to force the adoption of a more democratic system with a little more popular input that would eventually result in Assad losing power anyway. So the goal either way is his removal.
And do you think that is a goal mainly because of its connection to Iran? I mean, is the thing we ultimately most dislike about the current regime its friendly relationship with Iran and the way Iran can have a presence in Syria and do things by virtue of that?
Yeah, that's the main grievance. It gets at, the sort of conduit that Syria provides between Iran and Hezbollah, which creates problems for Israel. And again, just the sort of mindset that Iran having influence anywhere in the region is bad for the United States somehow.
Okay. Because, I mean, the issue of, withdrawing troops, I understand withdrawing troops from Iraq might well create a destabilization that would be a short-term problem, but including a political problem for whichever president did it. Whereas in Syria, it just seems like in principle, I don't know anything about I don't know why I'm saying this as if I had any idea what I'm talking about, but it just seems like, the withdrawal, Assad would presumably take that territory, but I don't see it being the kind of mess you would expect in Iraq. Am I wrong about that?
The U.S. is sitting on a relatively small part of Syria. It's not, in any position to sort of, it's not it doesn't have enough of a presence for a withdrawal to be destabilizing to anybody except the Kurds, who, have relied on the United States and been fairly reliable proxies for the United States and have already sort of suffered, a setback. I mean, you probably remember when Trump kind of ordered the U.S. off of the border, out of the border region, and Turkey moved in. And, obviously there's that's a whole nother discussion, Turkey and the Kurds. But then Trump was sort of convinced to leave this kind of residual force there, and I think the appeal was basically we can have the oil, and that was enough for Trump. And but that's there's sort of the Kurds, the SDF are sort of reliant on the United States and that to sort of protect their interests. And I feel. If I were running the SDF, I would have been in negotiations with the Syrian government, being the Kurdish.
Yeah, is that the political
Syrian Democratic Forces?
Yeah,
it's mostly the Kurdish militia, the YPG militia, But they created this SDF as kind of a cover, I think, and they incorporated a few small Arab forces into it during the fight against the Islamic State to kind of, I think, kind of show that, or kind of to demonstrate that they weren't just a Kurdish force, and that has to do with sort of the political dynamics in northeastern Syria, which is, part of it is predominantly Kurdish, but a lot of it is predominantly Arab, and kind of making themselves more palatable to the Arab population. Part of it has to do with the United States and its relationship with Turkey, so that we could kind of go to Turkey and say, look, this isn't just a Kurdish militia that we're backing; it's this other thing. So it's kind of fictional. There's some sort of Arab element to it, but it's mostly the Kurds. To me, the smart thing to do would have been, a couple of years ago to really start negotiating with the Syrian government over, what kind of political arrangement can we get? What kind of autonomy could we get for the Kurdish population of that part of the country in exchange for, handing back control of these places. They don't have the border anymore, but they still have these oil fields that they could trade back.
What was their status before the anti-Assad insurgency? I mean, what they wanted was a nation that would have transcended those local, the current boundaries. But were they more or less allowed to, were they persecuted? Were they allowed to, what?
Syrian Kurds, my understanding of it is, the Syrian Kurds have not been, or were not as badly treated as let's say the Kurds in southeastern Turkey. Assad kind of allowed them to function to some degree, but they weren't on good terms with his government. The YPG was not. They weren't like, on Assad's mailing list or anything like that. But after the war started, there was a lot of enmity between the YPG and the Islamic State and some of the Syrian rebel groups that are very sort of Islamist in their ideology, and they have worked with the Syrian government in some ways. They've sort of established, especially in a couple of border cities, a sort of tenuous kind of coexistence with whatever rump government security forces were still in those places, that occasionally flares up or has flared up into violence. But for the most part, they've been able to coexist. But then of course the Turkish invasion kind of sent all that into, kind of scattered all that into a little bit of disarray. Okay.
And do you have any sense, to get back to the conflict between the U.S. and the militias in Iraq and to some extent in Syria, do you have any sense of the implications for that, for the still ongoing attempt to restore the Iran nuclear deal? I can't tell whether the Biden administration is assuming we can just compartmentalize these two things and, walk and chew gum at the same time, as they say, in what is actually kind of an inapt metaphor, I think. But anyway, leaving that aside, or are they just willing to sacrifice the deal, or what? Do you have any sense for what's going on there?
I think it's partly meant to demonstrate to Iran and to the folks who are skeptical about reengaging in Washington, who are sort of skeptical about reengaging with the nuclear deal or outright opposed to it, that the Biden administration isn't going to give Iran a pass on everything else, that they do feel like they can kind of silo these things off for now. Part of the problem or the difficulty that they've had, I think, in some of the reporting, it's pretty clear that part of the difficulty they're having restoring the agreement, the nuclear agreement, is that the Biden administration is insisting on these follow-up talks for what they call a bigger and better deal. that would do a couple of things. It would extend some of the sunset clauses of the original deal, because we're now at the point where a lot of those clauses are going to be, coming up. And it would address other things like Iran's missile program, their relationship with, again, groups like the Iraqi militias, like the Houthis, like Hezbollah, and there's a lot of resistance to that on Iran's part, and a lot of it justifiably, because they couldn't, like the original deal didn't last but like 3 years before Donald Trump destroyed it, basically, in effect. And so they have, I think they have some, I would argue, justified concerns about entering into follow-on negotiations or committing to that when there's really no reason at this point for them to believe that the United States will stick by the original agreement as it was written. So that's been one of the main sticking points. But so I think, the idea is, look, we're not going to go easy on you just because we're trying to negotiate the nuclear deal, and maybe to sort of say the same thing to a domestic audience in the U.S., but also, to kind of push Iran, toward accepting the idea of these follow-on talks that would address a lot of this stuff, and maybe would in the U.S., from the U.S. perspective, would bring an end to a lot of these kind of troublesome non-state groups.
Yeah, it's not clear to me how attacking militias they support would make them more pliable in the negotiation. I understand the other part, kind of signaling to our constituency, and to some extent to them, that, don't get the wrong idea about what these negotiations imply, but,
right.
I don't, but, the whole thing is a mystery to me anyway. So, I want to talk a little about the overall kind of landscape of, kind of foreign policy ideology in the U.S. But before we do that, is there anything else you would say about this whole set of issues we've been discussing?
I mean, it is, I think we've covered it pretty well. The illogic of the United States sort of 40-year obsession with Iran has led it to some strange and I think not particularly helpful places, and the window that seemed to open in Obama's second term to kind of address that and come to some more productive relationship with Iran, not an alliance or anything like that, but just a place where we could be talking to one another, where there, was the possibility of engagement. I think, unfortunately, that has been foreclosed upon by Trump, and the kind of lingering, A, resentment sort of, but B, kind of mistrust that Trump's decision to pull out of that deal engendered. And it's really, I think, a lost opportunity. Even if they manage at some point to agree to restore the nuclear deal, I think the possibility of that serving as a springboard for something else, or some broader engagement has been lost, because why should the Iranians? I mean, they have no reason to engage on that level anymore.
No, you wouldn't think, and you wouldn't think it would be very appetizing to engage, for them to engage in that level in any event. So on the broader picture, like in DC, one thing we've seen, within the last few years is the emergence of a community that's, I guess the more or less official label is going to be restrainers, or the restraint community. In other words, very skeptical of intervention and very willing to entertain the possibility to, pull back the existing U.S. military presence in various parts of the world, and so on. There's kind of a realist tenor to it, by and large, I guess I'd say. We mentioned the Quincy Institute. That's the most prominent, probably, institutional manifestation of this. What's your take on And again, responsible statecraft is the now Quincy affiliated media entity that that you edited in its prior incarnation as Low
yes,
Blog.
it's a little different now, but yeah, I kind of
quite a bit, but still, Low Blog was the foundation it was built on.
I think it's an interesting kind of time in DC, and my focus is mostly on things that are happening abroad, so I don't have a lot of time to like watch, debates in Congress or that sort of thing. But I think we have some. That's where I've seen the biggest kind of shift. There are some people in Congress now, on the left who are much more vocal about the problems with the expansive U.S. military state, and questioning the kind of fundamental premises of that state than I think we've seen in a long time, and that's led to some developments. Where Congress, I think the House of Representatives even today is debating kind of repealing some long forgotten but still on the books things like the 1991 authorization for the Gulf War, and they've already voted on the 2002 authorization for the Iraq War, and I don't think you would have seen that. I think it's a relatively new and positive development to see that. I think you've got a long ways to go before those voices are seriously able to challenge the kind of establishment, the blob, as a lot of people call it, that mentality of kind of, maintaining what is in effect an empire, maintaining the frontiers of that empire. And even as you see this, even as the Biden administration talks about, withdrawing from Afghanistan, you see, conversations about putting a base in Central Asia to kind of monitor the same place, and kind of hedging about whether or not we're going to keep doing airstrikes against the Taliban. So I think that even in a development like that, which seems to cut against the establishment to some degree, it's been immediately kind of followed up with discussions about how we can maybe not withdraw completely, just kind of on paper. I think it's still entrenched. I mean, this kind of dominant, interventionist mindset is still pretty deeply entrenched, but you do see some people kind of picking away at the edges of it, and I think that's a good development, but it's going to take a while for it to really gain traction.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems one sign of the persistence of the blob, it seems to me, is that well, there's a couple of signs. Let me ask you what you think of kind of media coverage of foreign policy, maybe mainly in the Middle East, with which you're most familiar. Like you don't have to do a dissertation for us on this, but it seems to me the New York Times is still pretty much in a blob mindset. Am I imagining that? I'm wondering also if you see distinctions among, say, the Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, in terms of the quality of their coverage.
I think you're right. For the most part, there's a sort of reliance on, one of the things that I get frustrated about with the New York Times, especially, is there is a reliance on, kind of unquestioning reliance on the U.S. government, whatever sources that you may have in the intelligence community or wherever, to sort of, spin your narrative. And there's a reliance on a pretty narrow kind of segment of the quote unquote expert community, the think tanks, Foundation for the Defense of Democracies is, right. For example, somebody from FDD is quoted in every piece the New York Times writes about Iran pretty much. And it's going back to these same people who have the same kind of interventionist ideas or regime change or pushing regime change agendas and that sort of thing. My favorite bit of coverage from the Middle East over the last I would say, I guess, month now, or maybe a little bit longer, has been this. I don't know if you followed it, the saga of the Iranian naval ships that were crossing the Atlantic Ocean. That was in Politico. It was just the most absurd kind of alarmist coverage that it was such a big deal that these ships were entering the Atlantic Ocean as though the Atlantic Ocean is like U.S. territorial water and we claim the whole thing. And it was, that the framing of those pieces, and Politico is, a little maybe less august than the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, but it's still, it's something that gets read in DC. I think, my understanding is, it's pretty extensively. And, the way that they covered that story was just incredible to watch. These two kind of rickety ships that were maybe bringing arms to Venezuela under a deal that one country had reached with another country legally, that there's no, there's no violation of U.S. Of international law or U.S. sovereignty in any way, or threat to the United States. But this coverage of just kind of assuming that this was a horrible threat to U.S. security, and the Biden administration has to do something. And what are they, how are they going to stop this? As though that's a legitimate question to ask. And never questioning any of the assumptions behind it. I think it was just a perfect example of where a lot of major media outlets still are with this kind of stuff. Yeah,
my assumption there was that maybe somebody from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, this kind of extreme, I would say, militaristic and quite anti-Iranian think tank, had probably convinced some young reporter at Politico, like, this is like a scoop. You're going to be the first to report on this. And then Politico just got their teeth into it. Like, this is our story.
Man, yeah. They were the only ones covering it, which, there's a reason for that. It's not that big a deal. But yeah, I think you're right. They probably got fed it from somebody, maybe in the think tank world, maybe from, some part of the U.S. government, and just kind of grabbed onto it. It's like, this is huge. They're going to sell, guns and speedboats to Venezuela. Like, okay,
it's funny. I have one slightly alarming anecdote. Now the good news is this is probably from 6 or 7 years ago, but I was talking to it's a name you would know, I think, somebody who had reported for NPR. Still reports for NPR, had for quite a while on foreign affairs. And I was describing, explaining like where the funding situation at FDD and the fundamental character of it. And, Sheldon Adelson, who once advocated dropping a nuclear bomb in the desert of Iran, had given money to FDD and so on. And, this person said, oh, I guess, that explains it. And then added, that explains this is somebody who had used FDD as a source, clearly. Yeah. And hadn't known that, A. And then B said, oh, well, but when I talk to them, I also go get somebody at Brookings to give me a quote. And I thought, oh my God. Like, that's the spectrum. That's Brookings. That's the radical left to you. Yeah. And by the way, this is back when I think maybe Brookings has gotten moved a little. This is back when Brookings, this was, during the run up to the Iraq War, Brookings was quite a force on behalf of that enterprise.
Definitely.
And this was back more in that age. I'm seeing signs of a little more diversity of thought at Brookings. I don't know what's going on, or if their funding pictures changed, but this was really a senior NPR foreign policy correspondent. And I know.
That's amazing.
I know.
Yeah, but it is, it's the mindset. And that happens all over the political spectrum. The joke back in the Bush administration used to be, you'd have a Sunday roundtable with like two people from the American Enterprise Institute and like a reporter for the Washington Post. And this was supposed to be balanced, balanced coverage. And yeah, it happens everywhere. I mean, a lot of these places, and I can't speak to other think tanks, but having covered Iran, during my sort of low blog days, especially around the time that the nuclear deal was being negotiated, FDD did a lot of media outreach, to my understanding. Like they did a lot of like proactively kind of sending out newsletters and contacting reporters, and I think it makes it very easy to kind of rely on them. They present themselves as experts in these areas, and they hand you these, memos of, talking points and analysis, et cetera. And it makes it very easy as a reporter to kind of say, this is helpful. I can, frame my story around this. And that's unfortunate. And it's something I think that the sort of restrainer community is getting better at, but there's a lot of infrastructure that's already built into that kind of interventionist side of things that is still very active and very powerful.
No, FDD really understands what reporters need. I mean, they value, first of all, they value actual scoops. If you can give them information that will create a story, they'll do it. They know that reporters want good quotes. And to be fair, FDD has some people with genuine expertise, who can, save reporters time in that way. But, yeah, it's, so the battle goes on. Glad you could take the time. Now, I want to again, both mention your existing, the parts of your media empire that I've already mentioned. The foreign exchanges newsletter and podcast, but also you've got a new podcast coming up.
Yeah,
right?
This is I'm breaking news on your podcast. Actually,
I think this is what we've needed is
That's
to finally
to get a
finally
scoop.
have like a major scoop that would put us on the map. I mean, we missed the Iranian ships thing. We were a day late on
exactly. that. You came to that late, but I mean, I have foreign exchanges, which is at fx.substack.com. But I do have a new podcast that's in the works, with Daniel Bessner, who is a historian of U.S. foreign policy and, has been, has written fairly widely around. He's a columnist for foreign exchanges, for example. We're starting a new podcast called American Prestige. Meant ironically, somewhat ironically at least. We're planning our first episode for sometime around July 7th or 8th. It's going to be, sort of big picture discussions of U.S. foreign policy. Some of it will be based on the writing that I do at Foreign Exchanges and sort of covering international affairs, and we'll have guests, and we're pretty excited to get started with it, and it's just sort of really started coming together in the last couple of days. So I'm kind of excited and nervous a little bit about that, but brand new. So hope people will keep an eye out for that.
That's great. And Daniel has a very big interest in intellectual history. So will there be some of that dimension?
I mean, it's going to kind of try to meld our, the two things that we do. Like I write a lot about kind of international news. So I sort of, my brain is sort of on what happened today in this place and that place and this place, and kind of in an atomized way. So I feel like I don't get a lot of opportunity to talk about what it all means in a larger sense. So I'm excited to kind of bring the micro stuff that I do into conversation with Daniel, who's got this sort of more macro perspective on the theories and the intellectual history behind it.
Okay, great. And I had to briefly switch to promoting my stuff. First of all, I encourage people to rate and review this show, The Wright Show. Smash the like button on YouTube. And I have a newsletter called the Nonzero newsletter that gets into foreign policy with some frequency, not exclusively, but happens.
Yes, featured multiple times in foreign exchanges.
You have been kind enough to mention it. I gotta say, your output is amazing. I mean, I don't know. I assume you have like a staff of low wage laborers in some foreign country. I
have a couple of people who are do some other projects at the site, who I could call interns. I guess I don't. I pay them as freelancers, but no unpaid or low paid wage labor in overseas. It's pretty much just me, and I have some columnists and a couple of people who do some other things for me.
And there's a big history dimension in your newsletter. I don't want to make it sound like it's just current events, foreign policy. There's a lot of context, a lot of, you tell us, how would you describe your?
I mean, I've sort of started out, aimlessly kind of blogging. That's how this newsletter came to be in existence. Just to kind of have something to do as I was looking for a normal, like 9-to-5 job. And a lot of the stuff I wrote about was, related to Middle Eastern history, because that's where I'd come from. I come out of, Chicago with that background.
University of Chicago.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so I started kind of just writing little vignettes about, things that happened on this day in history or that kind of thing. And, I've just kept them as part of the material since then. And, as it's, I've shifted more towards what's happening today, like right now, as opposed to history. But I've kept that some of the stuff that I had already done as an aspect of the newsletter.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks again. Good luck with the new podcast. Everyone should check it out, and we'll talk to you down the road.
Thanks, Bob. This was great.